So, first, has there been any development with the stabbing murder of the high school student in El Sereno? Last we left it a week ago, there was still a search on for a second person involved. Has that changed?
Yeah, thank you and good morning. It's good to be back in person on these. Look forward to us doing this more in the future. I've not been briefed as to any additional arrests that are made. We're still looking for an outstanding person. The person was driving the vehicle. We believe that was part of that terrible murder.
I don't want to hog the time.
No, go ahead. Just throw him at me, and then if he's got something, he'll get me.
Okay. Back to the canine incident. You talked at length about it. One thing we.
Which canine incident?
I'm sorry, Lincoln Heights, where you had 3 officers with them.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. We heard that there's a little bit of push and pull that's gone on at Metropolitan Division having to do with canine being sent to calls or handling calls that might really be deplatoon calls and taking unnecessary risk. Obviously, people are kind of discussing what happened last week. Have you given any thought to that? And is there any validity to that? Is it a concern? Tell me.
Well, anytime we deploy specialized resources above a standard patrol deployment, those involve an evaluation of what are the circumstances that merit for the officer's safety, community safety, what tools and what specialized resources should we bring to bear. And there's an established set of criteria, including what constitutes a barricaded suspect for a quote-unquote SWAT call-out. Canine and the deployment of canine to conduct perimeter searches to locate and assist in the apprehension of individuals that are wanted for some type of crime, a felonious crime, a person potentially involved in gun violence or otherwise. Recovery of a gun, there's a whole set of criteria that a canine deployment, which is different than a barricaded SWAT deployment. But at the same time, depending on the circumstances of SWAT deployment, you may have a canine component. What I will assure the public and what we look at in each of these critical instances is what is our established policies, procedures or trainings and expectations. We'll investigate the circumstances of what led up to the search employing the 2 canine teams. And then what led to the eventual decision to consolidate that, and as they made entry into this structure and attempted to safely de-escalate and have this individual surrender, and unfortunately it escalated to a tragic shooting where our officers were wounded and the suspect apparently took his own life. Like every other categorical use of force, we will closely examine every step and every effort, every decision made, and that results of that investigation will be summarized in a Chief of Police report to the Board of Police Commissioners, and the Board of Police Commissioners will ultimately determine whether the tactics, decision to draw and exhibit firearms, and the use of deadly force met our policies. Included in that will be the determination of the use of a canine search team, or teams in this instance, versus it escalating to a use of a SWAT call-out or rollout and having them operate in order to resolve the situation.
To put a fine point on it, though, canine can use non-pyrotechnic chemical agents, like was used in this case. And the issue that was raised specifically was that when you're dealing with somebody who might be armed and is barricaded, they have to be physically very close in order to use it, as opposed to deplatoon that has the ability to use that sort of thing at longer range. And I wonder if that's something that...
Again, the use, as you said, of a canister tear gas is within the policies and procedures and the techniques that is afforded to a canine officer with the review and approval by a supervisor and the on-scene incident commander. We'll look to that practice, and that we'll continually evaluate the practice. And in this instance, did that action itself weaken or cause us to be in a more exposed position? Not saying it's good, not saying it's bad. One of my remarks about having other techniques and other tools is to try to continually evaluate how do we minimize the risk of an officer being shot by an assailant. But let me be clear on this, is that the use of a SWAT deployment, where it uses and can deploy tear gas by using a shotgun, for lack of a better term, to project it over great distances, when we release this critical incident, the public will see we're not talking about that type of standoff distance. The room in which this, or the rooms in which these officers found themselves in which this assailant was secreting himself, was very small. In fact, one of the impacts of this, when I looked very quickly at, preliminarily at a series of body-worn videos, is just how close and personal this was. And so that'll be, and I'm saying that to say that the use of the projected standoff distance and the ability to shoot a device, a pyrotechnic or not a pyrotechnic, a canister device, 50 feet or 75 feet, these distances weren't involved in this incident. And again, I think it's one of the reasons why we release these videos, these accounts, these descriptions, because right now we understand all the public has is a word picture. And all you have is what video footage there was from the media on outside that structure and not knowing what's inside. Pictures are worth more than 1,000 words, and I think these issues will more clarity. Lastly, I understand concerns, questions, scuttlebutt, if you will, but I have to say that I'm proud of the fact that these individuals survived this encounter. It was a deadly encounter, and it was the person they came against was armed and apparently willing to attempt to take their lives. And I'm grateful that they were able to survive it. Now, having said that, the judgment and the evaluation and how we determine how their actions met our standards is some distance from now. So one shouldn't be confused with the other. I heard the critics earlier about it appears that myself or others have already made our judgments here. Our judgment is that we're grateful that they survived. And our judgment also is looking to see, is there anything else we could or should do better in order to avoid both the loss of the injuries to these officers, potential their loss of life, as well as the loss of this man's life as apparently he took his own.
Chief, I wanted to ask you, you made it quite clear publicly about your desire to see Measure C repealed. What do you make about the proposal that was put forth by council members Coster and so on?
Well, I looked at it. It had a whole like a laundry list of things that appear to be at odds with one another. So binding arbitration, for instance, versus a continuation of a Board of Rights process made up of members of a different makeup than the current scheme allows. So I think that it served the purpose of that I believe brings discussion as to what does Measure C and its repeal, what's the next steps forward, and if that repeal does occur at the hands of the City Council, which I'm on record as supporting, as well as on the record of continuing to work with that council and the mayor, and certainly as well as the Board of Police Commissioners, as to ensure that any process going forward is fair. It demonstrates accountability for all parties involved, including the officers accused of serious acts of misconduct, and as much transparency as possible. So again, sometimes we can look at these motions and get distracted by aspects of it that I look at and don't agree with. For instance, binding arbitration is not something that I believe is in the best interest of the city or Frank, for that matter, for the public. But having said that, rather than calling that out and making some big ado about it, I think that we'll use that motion and we'll look to the council to move this discussion in support of what Mayor Bass has asked for, which is we've got to do better than what we're doing right now.
Just a quick follow-up on that. There seems to be a suggestion out there that the union is staffing some of these panels with examiners that are maybe more favorable to their positions, and that's the reason that a lot of these all-civilian panels are coming back and sort of dominating some of the discipline. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I don't judge it as whether or not there's any truth to that assertion. I will say that the process is that we identify, that the Board of Police Commissioners identify and select hearing examiners with an established criteria that are fair and impartial. The selection then of a makeup of an all-civilian board of 3 members is a process of the department selecting and discarding, and the advocate or the attorney for the officer selecting and removing people that they don't want to see impaneled, and eventually it works out to a group of 3. What should always happen is in the aftermath is that the Board of Police Commissioners should continually evaluate the fairness and the professional judgment and articulation of those panelists, and if they feel there's bias in any fashion, then take appropriate action. What the department wants is we want this board process to be fair, to be balanced, to not be unduly swayed by acts of favoritism or to seek the favor of the chief, or for that matter, the favor of the league. To that, I've got to go. We've got a closed session. You got one last thing?
One quick thing, just can you address some of the concerns that were raised in the room over there? I mean, I think chiefly that questioned whether this was the right forum to be advocating for the robot dog.
Well, I think that the process, this robotic, added technology, is in the public discussion. It was a matter that was before this commission. This commission supported it. It moves now to the city council, and it was a public session last week that talked and spoke about it. The public made remarks, as did my understanding is council members and others. And so I think that today was a appropriate place for me to remark about the use of that weapon. I'm sorry, the use of that system, the use of that technology, that tool, to de-escalate and to save officers' lives, as well as an effort to save the assailants and others that are hell-bent on harming someone. So I think it is, for a chief's report, to draw the connection, because there's discussions at point that suggest that our officers are not in such harm's way, that there's instances in which they can just quickly, just with a wave of a hand, things are rendered safe. And that's not the reality of what we saw, and we saw it this last week. And we see countless incidences in which we are safely able to resolve it. And I think that there's a sense that, well, these things will be okay. People do not appreciate just how hard this work is and how thin the margin is between a life and death circumstance. And so today was a remark to say, let's look at those circumstances, many of them that don't get covered because there's nothing to see here. It worked. And so this was the matter that our people, to give them the tools and the training, the techniques, so that they can go home, that they're safe, and that's as critical, as important as it is for anyone else in our city to accomplish the same. Okay? Thank you, guys.